Hi, I'm so happy you're here for Constitutional Consequences, Impeachment, and Congress After the Siege. I'm Victoria Nurse. I'm a law professor here at Georgetown, and I'm joined by my fabulous colleague, Josh Chaffetz, who we managed to lure it down from that wonderful institution called Cornell. We are both professors here at Georgetown, and we have a particular interest in U.S. Congress. Josh has written a fabulous book about Congress and the Constitution. We've both worked on the separation of powers, as well as presidential power. So we'll briefly introduce ourselves and then jump into discussing Donald Trump and the second and historic impeachment. So we'll answer your questions and feel free to continue to submit them online as we go forward. I'm so happy to be here with Josh. Over to you, Josh.
Well, thanks so much, Vic. Just to quickly introduce myself, as Vic said, I'm a professor at Georgetown University Law Center with affiliated appointments in both the government department and the McCourt School of Public Policy. That's in part because in addition to my law degree, I also have a PhD in political science. And as Vic mentioned, I've worked fairly extensively on separation of powers and on Congress and congressional procedure in particular. Most recently, my 2017 book with Yale University Press called Congress's Constitution, which is interested in sort of all of the things that Congress does other than passing laws. So that includes everything from government shutdowns to impeachment to censures to contempt of Congress and things like that. So a lot of sort of the kind of issues we've been talking about over the last few months as a country. And so I'm very excited to be able to talk about them with you, Vic.
Well, it's great to have this conversation because I've had the extraordinary opportunity to work in all three branches of government at different points in my life. Some when I was a baby lawyer. I've argued appellate cases for the Department of Justice and the executive branch. I also have worked in Congress as a senior lawyer for then chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Joe Biden. And I had the privilege to work for him as his chief counsel during the year his son, Beau, was dying in 2015. So as they say in the political science field, I have participant observations to add to this conversation. And it's one of the reasons that it's great for Josh and us to be together on the same faculty is that we can learn from each other. And having worked for a very long time, both academically and in government, we hope we can add to your understanding of what is going on. And it's truly, unfortunately, we hate that word unprecedented. Josh has written an article about the word unprecedented, but it is. So it's time to see what we can know about what's happening up on the Hill.
So Vic, I'd like to start with that. You know, your comment that you are a participant observer in all this, and as someone who did work on the Hill, work in the Senate, I just want to start by sort of getting your general sense. What has the last week been like for you? What was it like watching? What happened last Wednesday on TV? What were your thoughts?
Well, thanks, Josh, for asking me that. I mean, I have to say it was pretty sad. My first work on Capitol Hill was when I was 16 years old. I was an intern and in a House office working on lead paint abatement. We haven't still abated it, but it was very sad. I've worked in those buildings when I've been, on the Senate floor quite a bit as an aide to Senator Biden. And so I saw when the officer was trying to lead people away. I was watching it in real time because I live on Capitol Hill. And I was thankful that he was leading them away from the Senate chamber. And it was both despairing and kind of terrifying, in part because my youthful experience reminds me of how young many of the people over there are. There are many octogenarian senators, but many of the people who work on the Hill are very, very young. And like our students, this is something that they will never forget, and they were in harm's way. And that's the last thing that should be happening on Capitol Hill.
Absolutely. Well, and so obviously in response to that, as you mentioned at the beginning, Donald Trump has now been impeached for a second time, the only officer in American federal history to be twice impeached. And so I guess one question I have is, what's your view of when the Senate will move on impeachment? McConnell has said he doesn't intend to join with Schumer in calling them back sort of to meet during what was otherwise scheduled to be the pro forma session today. So what's your view of when they'll meet and how that impacts the sort of legislation and nominations that the Biden administration hopes to move in its first few weeks?
Well, excellent questions that many are asking. I'll offer you what I know about the Senate procedure for impeachment. I didn't mention, I just wrote a student book about impeachment over the past few months because we don't teach it in constitutional law. That's the strange thing, as Cass Sunstein once said.
Some of us do.
Yeah, you do. Good. That's why you're here. But the vast majority of people, Cass Sunstein's written in a book that they don't teach. He never heard a word at Harvard about impeachment. So here's the deal about the Senate rules on impeaching. Yes, we have civil procedure, but we also have congressional procedure, as you know, and there are special Senate rules on impeachment. When Nancy Pelosi sends the managers over to deliver the articles, they have 1 day. Now, that can be coordinated with both the future majority leader, Schumer, and McConnell, and it will be, I expect. There's some talk that they will do it the day before impeachment. I don't know. That's for them to decide. And here is the problem. For the majority leader, he wants a majority and he wants to be leader. And for that, he needs some senators from Georgia to be certified and to join the Senate. He won't be leader until that happens. And I have not, maybe you know something about when Georgia certified those elections. We also need the replacement for VP Kamala Harris. Some people have suggested it might not be until the 22nd that is all wrapped up. And there's some wiggle room here. I mean, even though the rules seem to say there's 1 day, as you know, the Senate in some ways can get around its own rules. It could pass a unanimous consent agreement quite easily.
Well, and just for our audience, it's worth noting there's a difference between a calendar day and a legislative day, right? Is it one calendar day or one legislative day that they have to act?
Yeah, I'd have to check that. I was reading them in a haze last night, but there is a
legislative days can last for many calendar days, or for less than one calendar day. So
yeah, so that could also provide them room. And we'll just have to see. That's actually can be a really complicated question. You have to ask the parliamentarian sometimes about how that works. The parliamentary has already been invoked by none other than the president-elect because he, knowing the Senate rules, this is a man who has always called himself a Senate man. He called her and said, well, look, can we bifurcate these proceedings whenever they occur so that we can get our nominations done and then proceed on the impeachment? And as I read the rules, I think there's room for that. And I expect that the majority leader will want to accede to that request. It's certainly possible for them to do those kinds of things. I've seen them act very quickly when they want to. Most of the time they don't want to. But in cases of emergency, as we saw with the House, they can get their troops together in short order when the country needs it.
And what's your view on the extent to which Republicans will sign on to this, right? I mean, so there's been a lot of reporting that McConnell is at least open to it. It sounds like, I mean, it seems pretty clear that Romney will be in favor of it again. Murkowski has suggested that she's likely to be, but that's so far that leaves a lot of room between the majority that you need to actually structure the trial and the 2/3 supermajority that you need to convict. What's your view of the likelihood of conviction?
Well, you're the political scientist, but 67 is a pretty hard number to get to. If you have 50 senators, of course, we've got double digits to get to. And yeah, I mean, it will all depend, in my view, on McConnell and how strong he is for impeachment. That will give people who have previously taken a different stand some cover, as they say in the political game, to go along with McConnell. He's a very powerful leader, and he is an important leader in the Republican Party. And so I would be watching what he is saying. I was surprised to see, but in one way, but in a one way, not. He was also a Senate man. He spent most of his life there. Imagine if Georgetown were overrun. You've joined our faculty fairly recently. I've been here for 10 years, but some people have been on our faculty for 40 years. And if somebody in the Senate is the same rule, those people are very personally aligned to the institution. And I think they found the whole idea just absolutely horrifying. So if he says something very aggressive, I don't know. What do you think? You're the political scientist.
Well, I think so. I think there's undoubtedly a lot to what you say about McConnell being upset by just having to, literally flee potentially for his life with a lot of his colleagues. Obviously, that infuriated Pence, right? The fact that he was sort of left to fend for himself. I think also, right, we have to talk about the Georgia elections in this context, right? McConnell, really likes being majority leader, and he's about to not be majority leader anymore. And I think there's no doubt that Trump at least hurt Republicans in Georgia. It's not to say that the Republicans would necessarily have won if Trump had behaved differently post-November, but he certainly didn't help Republicans in Georgia. And so I think in addition to everything else, McConnell blames Trump for losing his Senate majority, and that's gotta hurt. And I think McConnell is probably at least thinking about looking for a different direction for the Republican Party, right? And thinking about the ways in which he can play a role in leading the Republican Party in a different direction. And to the extent that he thinks he can come up with one, I think that's going to determine sort of how hard he is willing to whip his fellow Republicans and try to come up with those 17 votes, or not try to come up with those 17 votes.
What do you think about the timing in terms of how long an impeachment trial would go on? I mean, it seems to me that both sides have an interest in moving pretty quickly if we and when we get there. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's almost nothing to be gained from drawing this out, right? Everyone saw, in some ways, unlike the first impeachment trial, everyone saw what happened live on TV here. And there isn't that much additional information that needs to be produced, right? Either you think that Donald Trump incited this crowd and sent them to the Capitol to sort of attempt to overthrow the government, or you don't. And there's not much other information that's going to come out that's going to change your mind on that. So I think as far as making an informed judgment, I don't think there's any need for protracted proceedings. And as far as the politics of it, I think, right now, if you look at polls, a majority of Americans think that Trump should be removed and disqualified. A pretty significant majority. I think it was like 58, 59%. And a much larger majority think he's responsible for what happened. I think the further we get into the Biden administration, the more that memory is going to fade. So I think Democrats have a strong incentive to move this as quickly as possible. And Republicans who want to vote yes also have a strong incentive to just get it over with, especially the ones who are up in 22. Get it over with and try to sort of move on to something else so that your party is increasingly not associated with Trump, and maybe the primary voters in your state will forgive you for having voted to disqualify Trump. Or in the case of a number of members who aren't running again, they don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, the apologies have already started. Senator Langford has already apologized to the African-American community in Oklahoma, which is in Tulsa is huge. So I found that fascinating. In any event, let's get to the law, maybe. There have been some people, including former Judge Ludick. He was on the Fourth Circuit for a while. His most famous opinion was striking down the Civil Rights Remedy in the Violence Against Women Act, the original one. And he has written an op-ed in WAPO saying that you can't have an impeachment after the president has left office. What do you think about that argument?
Yeah, I think that. So I think we should also just some background on Judge Ludick, right? So Ludick is a Reagan appointee who has been very much an anti-Trumper, right? So this is not a sort of position coming from someone who's been pro-Trump. That said, Ludick is completely wrong. I think there's so the entire remedy of disqualifying, right? So for people who don't know, right? So once someone is convicted in a Senate trial on an impeachment, there can then be a second vote to disqualify that person from any future office holding. Right? That second vote is actually by majority, not by 2/3 supermajority. And it doesn't necessarily happen. So of the 8 people who've been convicted on an impeachment trial in US history, all of whom, by the way, have been federal judges, only 3 of them have been disqualified from future office holding. So it doesn't automatically follow. But that's an important part of the impeachment remedy, right? It's an important part of the constitutional scheme around impeachment, is that not only can you be removed, you can also be disqualified. And Ludick's position would make the disqualification basically meaningless, right? 5 minutes before someone was about to be convicted in a Senate trial, that person would just resign his or her office and then say, "Oh, I've now deprived the Senate of jurisdiction to try me." So I think just as a matter of constitutional structure, Ludick is wrong, and I also think as a matter of history, right? So we have an example of a post resignation impeachment trial. That's the trial in 1876 of Secretary of War William Belknap, who had resigned after he was impeached, but before the Senate could try him. He was ultimately acquitted in his Senate trial, but the Senate did determine first that it had the jurisdiction to try him. Now, this can sort of cut both ways, because some senators, even though the Senate as a whole determined that it had jurisdiction to try him, some senators explained their vote to acquit on the grounds that they didn't think the Senate had jurisdiction to try him. Nevertheless, there has been a trial of someone who is no longer in office, and I think you combine that with the sort of structural reasoning, and it just the sort of overwhelming evidence, in my view, is that this is intended to continue on post-office if necessary.
Yeah, I agree with you. I actually think as a textual matter, it's a very bad argument. You know, I specialize in interpretation and statutory interpretation, and I dashed off an op-ed and basically saying he's just rewritten the Constitution, which is to say he quoted it accurately, but then he decided to interpret it in a different way. So it's a form of anti-textualism, because the disqualifications clause is there for a reason. It was actually meant to limit the power, as you know, to avoid, you know, going out and hanging people or bills of attainder and things like that. But it's pretty clear that there is a separate vote. The precedent is there. The structure is there. There's even an originalist argument. We have pretty fancy originalists on our faculty, like Randy Barnett, and the founders knew about the Hastings impeachment, which was one going on in Great Britain, and at the time, it was, I think, the month before they met. You were also a historian, or a historian quasi political scientist. You can correct me, but I was always struck by the fact that it was very shortly before that. But he was long past the time he was in India. He was the Governor General of India, and they still impeached him afterwards. And some state constitutions actually allowed for you to impeach afterwards specifically. So I don't think it was something that they were particularly concerned with when writing the Constitution, but there are, and these have been enumerated in articles that have long predate Trump. Do you think they're going to make this argument if Trump's lawyers in the impeachment?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that'll be, you know, I think they've already started making it in the sense that a lot of Republicans in the House, starting with Leader McCarthy, right, their arguments in the House, right, was it's time to move on, right? Like, not that Trump didn't do anything wrong, but it's time to move on. And I think we're going to hear that argument even more in the Senate, right? He's already gone. What are you impeaching him for? I think that's going to be a pretty strong argument. And I think they will take, like, his defense will take that into a constitutional register by trying to at least argue that post office impeachment is impermissible. I'm wondering, what do you think the other sort of grounds of the impeachment will be? What of the defense will be, rather? What do you think? So let's assume that gets overruled, because, as you say, Democrats will have the majority. What else will be on the defense?
Yeah, they'll take a vote, as they did in the Belknap case, where they'll take a vote originally. There it was majority to continue the case. They talked about it as a question, you know, the late impeachment as a question of jurisdiction. So they'll take that vote, just like they took the vote on John Bolton, where what evidence? And that brings us to trial procedures. We have some students and alumni who've asked us some questions about this. Before we get there, though, I'll just answer your question. And they're going to argue the First Amendment, one. They'll also argue due process. That's what I heard when I was watching. I don't think the First Amendment argument is particularly compelling. I did tweet about this before, while they were writing the articles, and I said I thought they should avoid the word incitement, frankly, because of the First Amendment precedents, and you can probably tell our viewers about those. I think what he did when he was watching the television and did nothing is the equivalent of willful neglect. I taught criminal law for 15 years. And the governor of Michigan was just indicted on a theory like this, which is to say willful neglect, when you have a duty to act, can be a very serious crime. So I would focus more on his actions than his words, because he did not come out after President-elect Biden said, please come out and stop this. This is happening in real time. He had the knowledge, and then he failed to act. Now, he has to have a duty to act, but that's what I would focus on because of the incitement question. And then we can talk about due process. What do you think about the First Amendment piece?
Well, I think I might disagree with you a little bit here. I think they're both worth focusing on. I think the First Amendment is just completely irrelevant here. It has nothing to do with the impeachment process. Yes, it has to do with the extent to which Donald Trump can perhaps in the future be criminally punished for what he said. But there is a big difference between the standards for criminal punishment and the standards for impeachment. And frankly, I think the standards for impeachment, as I've written in several places, basically boils down to, is this person fit to hold office and fit to be trusted with office in the future? And riling up a mob and sending them to storm the seat of government. I mean, he basically asked a mob of his supporters to overthrow the American constitutional order. And to me, that is the basis for this impeachment. And I wouldn't want to move away from that emphasis. So I had a op-ed at NBC News yesterday, basically making this argument that that this is really about much more than the first impeachment. This is about the foundations of our constitutional order, right? He sent a mob to overthrow the first branch of government, and to my mind, that whether you want to call it incitement, call it sedition, call it conspiracy to commit any of the above. I don't really care about the language that's used here, but the underlying, and again, it shouldn't matter what the underlying language is because this isn't a criminal proceeding. The technicalities of criminal proceedings don't apply. What matters is the sort of deep constitutional foul that occurred.
Mm-hmm. Well, that brings us to reminding our audience that it isn't criminal. For some reason, the press and everyone keeps wanting to focus this on criminal law. There is a very capacious sedition law and conspiracy to commit sedition, which is basically violated by speech when you agree to do something. But really, people should not focus on that. And so thank you for reminding the audience. The first impeachment wasn't about this either. Basically, it was about, if you thought it was wrong, it was about interfering with an election, right? Getting foreign enemies to interfere in our election and encouraging them. And it's an assault on democracy and on the Constitution. Larry Tribe says that, the argument that there has to be a crime is a zombie argument. In his book with Josh Matz on the first impeachment. And it keeps coming up that this is the defense. Do you think he's going to have any lawyers before we get to the procedure? Who's going to defend him?
Well, it's interesting that, right, the news reports keep coming out that basically none of the sort of Republican elite bar wants to defend him. It sounds like not even a lot of the people who worked in the White House want to defend him. I mean, we may be left with the return of the Kraken, right? It might be Giuliani and Ellis who wind up leading this if no one else is willing to. Or, there's no reason that his defense attorney can't also be a sitting member of Congress, right? So it could be someone from the House. It could even be Josh Hawley. That I wouldn't be totally shocked to see something like that.
That would be fascinating. Excellent point. I never even imagined that. Okay, so I think we have some questions that are interesting from our very smart students and brilliant alumni about things like conflict of interest. What's bizarre about this impeachment is that the witnesses to the impeachment are also the judges, jurors, et cetera. The senators themselves were witnesses to the events. Mm-hmm. And participants in a normal criminal trial, of course, they could not sit as jurors or judges. So we have been asked, well, will this have an effect on the trial? What do you think?
I think as a predictive matter, if it has any effect on the trial, it will make conviction more likely, and for precisely the reasons you talked about when talking about McConnell, right? Which is these people literally had to flee for their lives. Like they're not inclined to be forgiving of the person who caused that. Now, in a criminal trial, that's precisely why they'd be disqualified as jurors. But again, that's not what impeachment is about. And I think this goes back to my view of why this is all so awful, right? Which is that it was an attack on a coordinate branch of government, right? It was, and therefore, an attack on the foundations of our constitutional order. Of course, the sort of witnesses to it are going to be the members of that other branch of government. That actually makes them the most qualified, I think, to determine whether or not he should be removed and disqualified, rather than unqualified, which is, again, how we would do this if this were actually a criminal proceeding, which it emphatically is not. Mm-hmm. I don't know. What's your view? Do you think that this puts senators in a difficult position?
They'll want to decide. They'll either want to be for him or against him, so they won't recuse themselves, in my view. Mm-hmm. And their argument would be essentially that that the Senate it creates its own rules on impeachment, and they can decide whether to recuse. And as it is a constitutional proceeding about the status of government, this actually adds to their ability to judge appropriately rather than detracts from it. I don't even think we'll hear much about that argument. Someone has asked just as a follow-up about whether what happens if people try to are people going to expel Hawley and Cruz? And what happens if they're expelled? Well, certainly, I don't think that's going to happen sooner than the impeachment. I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, so yeah, it requires a 2/3 vote to expel a member from either chamber. So I find it almost inconceivable that either Hawley or Cruz would be expelled. I don't see the votes there to do it. I think there might be expulsion motions brought forward as a sort of way of forcing them on the record to defend themselves, and perhaps a way of forcing their colleagues to defend them. But I don't see it actually succeeding.
When I was sitting watching the other day, the House, as I noticed that many people were reverting to censure. Tell me what you think about censure as an alternative.
I mean, it's been the alternative to impeachment since at least Andrew Jackson, right? So the Senate famously censured Andrew Jackson for his role in the bank wars. It's, so first of all, you can censure by bare majority, right? So it's something you can do if you don't have the votes to convict on impeachment. The early censures were taken very seriously. Jackson responded sort of outraged to his censure. John Tyler responded outraged when just a Senate committee voted a censure resolution against him. I think in the context of 19th century honor politics, censure maybe struck a little bit closer to home. I think in the context of 21st century, especially Donald Trump, who has shown repeatedly that he has zero capacity for shame, I don't see exactly what censure would accomplish here. But I can see why Republican members who don't actually want to defend his conduct are sort of pushing for it. I don't know. Do you see it as sort of having any more teeth than that?
No, I don't even think that it will come up very much in the Senate. It might for his defenders, but it's really a very weak sanction because all it is a passage of a statement. I think this is what in Jackson they just said, you have acted unconstitutionally or something. And then in the honor politics, they got all excited and wanted to expunge it. They kept spending time trying to expunge it.
And they did eventually expunge it.
And they did. But that's not where we are today. And I think it's sort of like a slap on the wrist and won't satisfy either side, to tell you the truth. What about pardons, though? What do you think?
What about
self-pardon?
Oh, so I mean, self-pardon is like, my view is it's probably impermissible, but we don't. The constitutional text is tough here, right? Because the constitutional text leaves the pardon power completely unqualified. The only qualification is that you can't undo an impeachment through a pardon. Right? The pardon doesn't apply to impeachment proceedings, but other than that, it's completely unqualified. That said, I think I find persuasive the argument that there are sort of background legal norms that are so well entrenched, a sort of Riggs v. Palmer, like no one. Right, Riggs v. Palmer, for people who don't know, is a famous case that's always taught in sort of some first year course, right? Which is you can't, if you kill someone, you can't inherit from them, right? Even though the law doesn't specify that you can't inherit from someone you've killed, there's sort of a basic principle that no one should profit from his own wrongdoing. I think there's sort of a similar background principle here. That said, who knows what, I mean, ultimately this is a lot of the questions we've been talking about are non-justiciable. It's hard to imagine them getting to courts. It's hard to imagine the courts wanting to deal with them. This is paradigmatically justiciable because either Trump is tried for some crime, in which case he argues a self-pardon as a defense, or not, and it doesn't become relevant. So who knows what the courts would do with this? What do you think? What do you see the 6-3 Republican Supreme Court doing with this?
Well, they're textualists, which means that they'll want to look for some text and they'll see the pardon power as unqualified. there's a tendency to add into the equation about the pardon power that it is absolute. Of course, it doesn't say that. It's sort of like saying the president has all executive power, which it doesn't say that either. It says the executive power shall be vested. So there may be some arguments, but I actually think that that hopefully common sense will prevail. I think the reason Trump hasn't done it already is actually political, because the principle that, as you know, as a student of the separation of powers, no one shall be a judge in their own cause, which is an ancient Latin phrase, which I can't pronounce. is,
Nemo iudex in sua causa.
yeah, there you go. Inspired the entire separation idea, right? So that you wanted to separate the functions so that they couldn't judge their own cause. So the legislature or the executive couldn't, set the rules so they were checks, etc. And the average American understands that if they commit a crime, they cannot pardon themselves.
Right.
So he would have done this before, in my view, if people weren't telling him that this would be massively unpopular, even among probably people who thought, as I've heard last night, plenty of people loved his policies, but have suddenly decided that someone who attacks the Capitol just is not someone that they can support. And I think that would be similar in this case. Mm-hmm. I don't think the court would uphold it, but of course it would get there if he were prosecuted, because there's already a criminal investigation against him in New York State.
Well, of course, a pardon wouldn't apply to that.
Yeah,
right?
And this, right, and this wouldn't apply to that.
Well, just I also think it's right. So it is worth emphasizing that, right? The pardon, even if it were valid, would only apply against federal prosecution, not against state prosecution. Mm-hmm. I also think, right, I mean, that's the likelihood of a conviction and disqualification on the impeachment charges goes up significantly if he tries to pardon himself. The other thing he could have done, right? He could have avoided all of this by resigning at 11 a.m. on January 20th and having Pence pardon him, except he has now so thoroughly ticked off Mike Pence by leaving him on his own as a mob stormed the Capitol that, according to reporting, he doesn't trust that Pence would pardon him if he did that. So he's really shot himself in the foot here, right? If he could have secured for himself a pardon, I think, and one that would have been fairly rock solid, right? It wouldn't have been a self pardon. If only he had avoided really annoying his vice president.
Yeah, that's fat. Yeah, I hadn't thought quite about that because, of course, we have a precedent for that. In Nixon. Now, we have a student question, I think, about Georgia Congresswoman Green, who has pledged to attempt to impeach Biden on the very first day. Well, we need a high crime and misdemeanor first. I think this is bizarre, but it is a problem with impeachment. If you look at history, you see that they tend to be, when people get riled up, they respond. There was a series of impeachments. I once wrote a book about Oklahoma politics. Well, really about a Supreme Court case called Skinner versus Oklahoma, but I learned a lot about it. And during the 1920s, there were competing impeachments over and over again, because once one party does it, the other party will do it. Now, obviously, Joe Biden has to do something wrong before you can impeach him. But what do you think about that? Will this one of the questions is, will this yield unity or create disunity if the Senate goes forward with impeachment?
I would say neither of the above, right? I think what has become even clearer, sort of both by Trump's behavior post the election and sort of refusing to accept the results, and even more so since January 6th, is that he has sort of created and deepened a real split in the Republican Party. That doesn't mean it's an even split, right? I mean, as we saw with the House vote, the vast majority of Republicans voted against impeachment, but even the ones who did were sort of fairly critical of Trump in explaining their votes. Almost no one was actually willing to stand up and say Trump did nothing wrong, right? So I wouldn't talk in terms of unity or division. I'm more interested in sort of coalitions and sort of what's possible in terms of coalition building. And there is a sense in which this potentially makes some kind of bipartisan action more likely, right? If you have a unified Democratic Party and a split Republican Party, that creates the opportunity for coalitions that cross party lines in that way. I'm not sort of confident that would happen on major policy issues, or at least controversial policy issues, right? We're not going to see that happen on probably immigration or something like that. But on stimulus spending, probably we are. On sort of COVID relief packages, probably we are. And so I don't think it creates unity or division, but I think it creates the possibility for coalition building.
Yeah, I agree with you. And if anyone can do that, someone who spent 35 years in the Senate kind of knows how it works. So I don't really think this will affect the legislative agenda. They've been building this long before. As you see, they've already rolled out the first trillion package because they're following the model of the Recovery Act, which the vice president in 2008 actually negotiated and got the 60 votes. It is interesting because we've had some student questions about this. Is just an aside. We can get back to impeachment in a second. That he's already indicated that he wants to get the 60 votes. He's not moving by what is called reconciliation, which takes 51 votes. You can do that with a list of numbers, essentially, under the Budget Act. And I actually think that's a good move. And I think this is bizarrely, I'm sorry that it had to take this, because the structure of what McConnell did with Obama could be done again. He could just say, I'm not going to let anything go through. I doubt he'll do that to Biden for a variety of reasons personally, because they know each other. But if this kind of thing will tend to bring the Senate people together, it's like a club in that sense. And they'll feel very strongly, I think. The same kind of feeling I saw when I was on the floor when you're much too young for this, Josh, but when George H.W. Bush, I was a baby lawyer when we went to war with Kuwait, and it was amazing. They acted on the resolution in just an hour or something. The generals were all in the room and everyone was very, very serious. I think you're going to see a very, very serious Senate moving forward on legislation, moving forward in the impeachment. So I don't actually think that this will have too much of an effect on the vice president's agenda, as the students have asked.
Well, so I want to comment on that. So I'm maybe a little bit less sanguine than you are about how the Republicans will react to this, but I think Biden's initial approach as an opening gambit makes a lot of sense here, right? You say, oh, I don't want to touch the filibuster. Oh, I don't even want to go through reconciliation for this. And you say that because if eventually you do get to the point where you want to nuke the legislative filibuster, you need to bring along Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema and a few other members who've said that they're skeptical of it. So what you do is you say, you know, that's off the table. We're gonna go through the normal legislative process. We need 60 votes. Here's this really important, sort of urgently needed package. Let's get to 60 votes. Either you get to 60 votes, great, done, or you don't. And every time you fail to get there, Manchin and Sinema get a little bit more pissed off and a little bit more convinced that there's no working with this Republican minority until the point that they're willing to nuke the legislative filibuster. And that's a perfect rerun of what happened in 2013 with the filibuster for nominations, right? You start that Congress with a bunch of Democrats saying, we're never going to nuke the filibuster for nominations. And about 2/3 of the way through the Congress, they're so fed up that they're willing to do it. So either way, I think talking about bipartisanship and talking about not nuking the filibuster at this point makes perfect strategic sense.
I agree. I mean, it's my husband's a political scientist, so he calls it grit, you know, tit for tat, you know, but graduated. So if they continue, if they do what they did to the Obama, you know, appointments, which they refused to follow, you'll see a graduation of conflict. I don't think they're going to do that right now. I don't think they're going to attack the nominees, who many of whom are quite well.
I think the nominees will sail through. Yeah.
Yeah. And because the country's in trouble. I mean, the country's in trouble with COVID. I mean, forget about, we keep talking about impeachment, but we've got multiple crises on our hands. So where do you want to go now? What's your favorite unanswered question here, Josh?
So I guess, you know, one other thing that people have been talking about is Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. I wonder if that's worth talking about, right? This
Sure.
is a different provision by which someone could be disqualified from future office holding. What's your take on that versus impeachment, or sort of in addition to impeachment or something like that?
I think it's complicated legally and politically. I'm not an expert in this, so I'm eager to hear what you have to say. This came out of the Civil War, and that in of itself has a taint. So its history, it's also opaque to many of the senators. This is not something, as far as I understand, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that has been tried outside of the Confederacy. Maybe it has, but it's not something they're going to know about. and they will want to go with what they consider to be regular order. And you know, what it says is essentially, if you have committed insurrection against the government, right, you can be disqualified from office. And so I don't know. I mean, I think because of its uncertainty, they won't want to go there. But what do you think?
I tend to think you're probably right. I mean, I think what's interesting about it is I think it could be, so the other thing, right, is that the 14th Amendment doesn't specify how you determine whether someone has engaged in insurrection. You then have Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, which allows Congress to pass legislation enforcing the previous provisions. So you could say, so my view would be Congress could pass a law, right, simple majority or majority in the House, and then either 60 votes in the Senate, which is still less than 67, or maybe nuking the filibuster for that or something. But you could pass a law, I think, declaring that Donald Trump had engaged in insurrection, and that would trigger 14.3. I think perhaps also, I mean, some people have talked about this with members of Congress, right? If one could imagine, suppose that it turned out that some member of the House had actively, shown the rioters in, pointed out, hey, there's Steny Hoyer's office, go get him, or something like that. I think you could sort of couple an expulsion with an invocation of 14.3, which would disqualify for future office holding. But I agree with you that this all seems highly unlikely, that if the votes aren't there to convict on impeachment, they're not going to be there to invoke 14.3.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think we're likely to see that, this might come up when they're trying to figure out what to do with people if they do find participation. On the other hand, those people will also probably be indicted. If you can show an agreement, basically, with the crowd, that's seditious conspiracy. If they, people, you don't have to actually say, I want to, I want to bring down the Capitol. All you have to show is that you agreed to allow these people and aided and comforted them in some substantial way. That doesn't violate the First Amendment because you have to commit an act to further the conspiracy. It might be in Congress's interest to just let the criminal process go forward. What do you think about that?
Well, being convicted of a crime doesn't actually result in your expulsion from Congress, nor does it result in disqualification to hold office in the future, right? So you could imagine, some member from an extremely Trumpy district who gets convicted, who goes to prison, who gets reelected from prison, who refuses to resign, right? You could imagine that happening. I mean, this is basically what happens when Preston Brooks canes Charles Sumner, right? He resigns from the House, and then his South Carolina constituents reelect him because they wanted him to beat up this Northern abolitionist, right?
Yeah.
So it's, one could imagine a situation where it came to that.
Well, this could be really fascinating for all of us Constitution geeks, because you're right. Alcee Hastings was impeached
and convicted
as a judge because he took bribes, and then promptly ran for Congress and was elected.
And is serving to this day.
Yeah. So if it's correct, as McConnell said, that he wanted to kill that part of the party, you might actually want to go there, even whether, and it's 60 votes is easier than 67 for expulsion, right? So it will be fascinating for all of us con law geeks. We make a joke in our field to all of those watching this presidency has been very good for our exam writing capabilities, because it's sad. As I said, I was sad, but things that we never thought could possibly happen have raised new questions that we hadn't considered. Okay, where do you want to go next? Congress as an institution. You've written a lot about this.
Well, I think we're running a little bit short on time, but yeah, let's try one more topic. So what is the question about Congress as an institution?
Well, some people have asked, I think there are a couple of students, alumni, well, what can we do about Congress? Congress we study it. It's the least favorite institution known to man. It is, however, democracy. So I tell my students, if you see the word politics, make sure you know what you're talking about. If you talk about it as partisanship, people hate it. If you talk about it as democracy, they love it. So you've written about trying to strengthen Congress as an institution. Now, that may happen if they actually act in a certain way that people find responsible, right, through the impeachment. But are there any other things you want to tee up for the audience that need to be done sooner rather than later?
So I think there's a lot of sort of specific ways Congress can strengthen itself as an institution. I would actually commend people to the American Political Science Association Task Force on the Modernization of Congress, which I was honored to be a member of. Last year put out about a 50-page report with a lot of recommendations, many of which were actually adopted by the House Committee on the Modernization of Congress, and many of which can be done by a single House. So that's encouraging. I would think, though, my biggest point on this goes back to the way you started, which is we need to, part of it is as educators and members of Congress in their role as sort of educating their electorate, need to point out that this is what democracy looks like in action, that legislatures are often sort of unpalatable when people watch them in action. But the alternative, right, is basically autocracy, right? Autocracy looks like everything is running smoothly. To the extent that people think of friction and deal making as distasteful, they are thinking of democracy as distasteful. And to the extent that they believe in democracy and self-governance, they should actually be cheering these things that sort of look bad to them. So I think part of the answer actually is civic education of a particular kind. What do you think? Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I have sort of this pipe dream to create something called a Congress blog, like the SCOTUS blog, where people actually learn from experts. There's this thing called Monkey Cage, which is in Washington Post, but it doesn't really follow the procedure in a way and treat it as seriously as we treat civil procedure. Even though we know that, procedure is substance, et cetera. I think people, the press can't take the time to teach people about the filibuster and that it's a constant presence, not a big speech. So I agree with you. We really got to think hard about how to get that in the Twitterverse. I know you're on Twitter a lot, which is great, to try to understand what's going on. And when I talk to staffers, they say, look, contempt for Congress is a self-fulfilling prophecy, because then you elect people who want to tear down the institution. The one thing, when I interviewed a bunch of people in Congress, I had left to go teach. And in 2000, I did a survey with Jane Schachter out at Stanford, and I was shocked because folks in the Senate were saying, people used to have pride in this body, and now there's a significant move to elect people who hate the body, who want to tear it down. And I didn't realize at the time how prescient that was. And so we need a lot of education. And we also need Congress to stand up actually to provide good materials that are actually accessible. I mean, the congressional record is very hard to read. So they could do something about this, I think.
Well, one good move is as of last year, all Congressional Research Service reports are now available for free online, which didn't used to be the case.
That's actually great, because they know a lot. I mean, I go up there and talk to them sometimes about what they do, and they hear from me about how courts treat them. Courts themselves actually don't understand this, and they get these things wrong. I mean, one of my pet peeves is that,
as you've shown very well in your
work.
Work.
King versus Burwell, even the Chief Justice got the passage of the Affordable Care Act wrong, in my opinion. He didn't understand the difference between reconciliation and a filibuster. It was passed in the middle of the night on December 24th, and Joe Biden sitting in the chair, and every senator knows that, but somehow the Chief Justice doesn't. I mean, I appreciate the Chief Justice's opinion. It was extremely well written, but this is the kind of thing, and law schools are to blame in part too, but we at Georgetown are trying to do our bit since we are here at the nation's capital, and we're trying to build a great team here to try to continue to educate folks. So where do you want to go now?
I think we're being asked to wrap up, so I think we may have to sign off at this point. But this has been a tremendously edifying discussion. I've learned quite a bit, as I always learn when I'm talking to you, Vic. And this has been
I have to say I'm delighted that Josh accepted our offer to come down here from the cold of New York in Ithaca, because he's really made a great addition to the faculty, and we're going to be moving forward, and we're going to have the best faculty in the country on this. All right, absolutely. We're going to go off to see students now. Students, thank you, alumni. Thank you, AV, Zoom.
Bye. Everyone. Thank you so much.